In my Palm Springs home, at 69 years old, my own two children, Mark and Chloe, cornered me. They waved bank statements in my face, accusing me of reckless spending, and demanding a conservatorship over my entire estate, treating me like a senile old woman in need of control. They had no idea they were fighting over a few $1 million while trampling on the real inheritance. A $90 million fortune from Syntho Gen stock they were too foolish to recognize. They thought they were cornering a helpless widow, but they were wrong. They woke a lioness, and I wasn't just going to take back what was mine, I was going to turn the very stage they built to humiliate me into the one where I exposed them for who they truly were to the entire world. The desert sun of Palm Springs has a way of bleaching secrets, of baking them out of the earth and into the shimmering air. But mine, it seemed, were stubbornly holding on. I sat in my favorite Eames chair, the buttery leather a familiar comfort against the rising tension in my own living room. Opposite me, my children, Mark and Chloe, sat on the white linen sofa, arranged in what I could only describe as a pincer formation. My son, Mark, ever the pragmatist with his tailored suit and perpetual frown of fiscal responsibility. My daughter, Chloe, the master of emotional leverage, her face a carefully constructed mask of loving concern. And next to Mark, my daughter-in-law, Jessica, played the role of the gentle mediator, a role she had perfected over 10 years of marriage. "Mom," Mark began, placing a sheaf of papers on the glass coffee table with the gravity of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "We need to talk about these. Bank statements. My bank statements. I didn't need to see the highlighted lines to know what they pointed to. Large withdrawals. Transfers to accounts they didn't recognize. Charges from boutiques in cities I had supposedly just visited. I don't think we do, Mark," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. I smoothed the silk of my caftan, a vintage piece I'd designed myself decades ago. Its vibrant turquoise and gold pattern felt like armor. "My finances are my own affair. Not when they're disappearing at this rate," he shot back, tapping a highlighted figure. $15,000 last month alone. 15,000. On what, more Chanel? Another trip to Milan. Dad's portfolio wasn't infinite. Arthur, my late husband. It always came back to Arthur's money, never mine. As if the 40 years I'd spent building a life and a brand alongside him had earned me nothing but a temporary stewardship of his legacy. A legacy they were now determined to protect. "Your father trusted me to manage our affairs when he was alive," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on my son. "That trust didn't expire with him." Chloe leaned forward, her voice soft and laced with practiced sympathy. "Mom, nobody is saying that. We're just worried. You're 69, you're alone. We see these statements, these trips you're taking without telling anyone it's not like you. It seems reckless. We're scared you're being taken advantage of, or maybe you're just not," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air-conditioned silence. "Not in your right mind." Jessica placed a perfectly manicured hand on Mark's arm. "What Chloe is trying to say, Sandra, is that we love you. We just want to make sure you're secure for the rest of your life. Dad would have wanted that." The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Arthur would have wanted them to mind their own business. He'd always known their natures. Mark, who saw life as a balance sheet, and Chloe, who saw emotions as currency. He used to call them his little vultures, with a sad shake of his head that was half joke, half prophecy. A prophecy that was now coming to pass. "I am perfectly secure, Jessica, thank you," I replied coolly. How could I explain the $15,000? How could I tell them it wasn't for a handbag, but for new plumbing and security cameras at the Oasis Haven, a shelter for women and children fleeing abuse? How could I tell them my name was on the deed, a secret I'd kept for 5 years, a promise I'd made to its founder, a dear friend who had passed away? They wouldn't understand a charity that didn't come with a gala and a tax write-off. To them, it would just be another example of my financial incompetence. And the trips? The flights to New York, the hotel in San Francisco, they saw reckless tourism. I knew them as clandestine meetings with textile suppliers and ethical manufacturing experts. They saw me squandering a legacy. I was building a new one. A brand of sustainable fashion, a final act in a career I thought I'd left behind, a dream I was bringing to life with my own capital, my own vision. Explaining that to them would be like showing a sketch to a wrecking ball. They would see only risk, not potential. "Mom, please," Mark sighed, the sound of a man at the end of his patience. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "We've spoken to our lawyer. He's drawn up some paperwork for a financial conservatorship. It's a formality, really. It just gives me the ability to oversee the accounts, to make sure everything is invested properly, to protect you from yourself." The room went cold. Conservatorship. a legal term for caging someone in the name of love. They weren't just suggesting, they were threatening. You spoke to a lawyer about my life without speaking to me? My voice was a low whisper, but it carried the weight of my fury. We tried, Mom. Chloe's voice rose, the mask of concern slipping to reveal raw frustration. We call, you're busy. We ask what you're doing, you say you're out. We see you in a new designer dress every week. What are we supposed to think? I thought of the dresses. Most were samples, prototypes for my new line that I was testing for fabric, durability, and drape. The others were from my own archives, pieces I hadn't worn in years. But they didn't see design or history. They saw price tags. My phone buzzed on the side table. I glanced at the screen. It was Maria, the director at Oasis Haven. I knew I shouldn't, but I answered, holding a finger up to my children. Hello, Maria, I said, turning slightly away from them. Sandra, I am so sorry to bother you, but I just had to call. Her voice was warm, filled with an emotion I hadn't heard all morning. The new security system is in. The women feel so much safer. And the plumber fixed that leak in the main house. You are an angel. I don't know how we can ever repay you. There's nothing to repay, Maria. Just keep doing the wonderful work you're doing, I said, my heart aching with the difference between this conversation and the one I was having in person. God bless you, Sandra. Mark cleared his throat loudly. Mom, we're in the middle of a very serious discussion here. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. Maria, I have to go. I'll call you back. I hung up and placed the phone face down. Who is Maria? Chloe asked, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Is that who you're giving money to? She's a friend, I said, the words feeling inadequate. A very expensive friend, it seems, Mark muttered, gesturing again to the papers. Look, Mom, this isn't a negotiation. The inheritance from Dad is a finite resource. At your current burn rate, the principal will be gone in 5 years. What happens then? You'll be dependent on us. We are doing this to prevent that. It's the responsible thing to do. He said responsible as if it were a holy word. As if his version of responsibility, hoarding wealth, minimizing risk, living a life calculated down to the last decimal point, was the only one that mattered. He had no concept of a responsibility to one's community, to a promise made to a dying friend, to one's own soul. I stood up and walked to the large picture window overlooking my garden. The bougainvillea was a riot of fuchsia against the white stucco wall. The hummingbirds, tiny iridescent jewels, darted between the blossoms. Arthur had designed this garden for me, a sanctuary of color and life. Now, his own children were trying to turn my life into a monochrome prison. So you want to take my money, my independence, and my life, and put it in a neat little box with your name on it, I said, not turning around. We want to manage your assets, Mark corrected, his voice hard. And what happens when I want to buy a dress, or take a trip, or help a friend? Do I have to submit a request in writing to you, my son, the chief financial officer of my life? It would be a conversation about budgeting, yes, he said, utterly serious. I finally turned to face them, the three of them, a united front of loving, suffocating concern. Jessica was looking down at her hands, playing the part of the reluctant participant. Chloe was trying to look sad for me. Mark just looked determined, like he was closing a difficult but necessary business deal. The silence in the room was a canvas, and they had painted me into a corner. Now they were waiting for me to surrender the brush. I let out a laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was brittle, sharp, like glass shattering on a marble floor. The three of them flinched. A conversation about budgeting, I repeated, the words tasting like poison. My 69-year-old self having a conversation about budgeting with my 35-year-old son who, if I recall correctly, still needed his father to co-sign the loan for this very suit he's wearing to threat me in. Is that the conversation we're talking about, Mark? Mark's face turned a blotchy red. That was 5 years ago. This is different. Is it? It feels remarkably similar. You want something you feel entitled to, and you've decided my needs are an obstacle. Jessica, ever the peacemaker, jumped in. Her voice was as smooth as cream. Sandra, darling, that's not fair. We're a family. We should be able to discuss these things openly. For instance, she said, her eyes sweeping the room and landing on a new sculpture in the far corner, a fluid, abstract form of polished steel. That piece is just magnificent. Is it a Gallucci? We saw one at a gallery in LA, and it was a fortune. It's a wonderful investment, of course, but maybe now is the time to be more liquid. Her words were perfectly chosen, a dagger wrapped in velvet. She was complimenting my taste while simultaneously accusing me of extravagance, painting me as an art-obsessed widow frittering away her cash. I gave her a thin smile. It's from a student at the Coachella Valley Art Center. Her name is Lena. I paid for her welding materials and she gave it to me as a gift. It cost me $200 and a belief in her talent, an investment I'm very proud of. I let my gaze linger on Jessica, on her new diamond tennis bracelet that certainly hadn't come from a student. Some investments, you see, aren't about liquidity, they're about value. The barb hit its mark. A flicker of something annoyance, guilt, crossed her face before she composed it back into a mask of serene neutrality. Chloe stood up, wringing her hands. This is getting us nowhere. Mom, can't you see we're just trying to help? We don't want to fight. Then don't, I said, my voice hardening as I stood to my full height. I suddenly felt like the designer in her own atelier again, surveying a flawed collection before dismissing it entirely. This discussion is over. You came here with your highlighted papers and your pre-packaged threats. You have my answer. It is no. My life, my choices, and yes, my money will remain my own. I suggest you remember that. I walked towards the grand entryway, my back straight, not waiting to see if they would follow. I have things to do this afternoon. I'm sure you do too. Mark scrambled to his feet, gathering the rejected bank statements. You're being emotional, Mom. When you think this through rationally, you'll see our point. The offer to help stands, but it won't stand forever. We will have to take further steps if you force our hand. Is that a threat, Mark? I asked, pausing with my hand on the ornate handle of the front door. It's a promise to protect this family's legacy, he said, his jaw tight. You are mistaken, I said, pulling the heavy door open, letting the blinding desert sunlight flood the cool marble of the foyer. Arthur's legacy isn't in a stock portfolio. It's in the choices we make, the integrity we show. You might want to consider that. Now please leave my home. They filed out in stony silence, a defeated little army. Jessica gave me one last look, a calculated mix of pity and sorrow that was more infuriating than Mark's open hostility. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, the silence of the large house pressing in on me. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from a profound, seismic rage. I walked back into the living room, past the sofa where they had sat in judgment, and picked up a silver-framed photograph from the mantelpiece. It was Arthur and me in Paris, 20 years ago. We were laughing, caught in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. His arm was around me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He had always been my champion. Don't ever let them make you feel small, Sandy, he used to say. You were a force of nature before I ever met you. I drew strength from the memory. I was not a fragile old lady. I was Sandra Laurent, a woman who had built an empire from silk and dreams, who had faced down ruthless buyers and navigated the treacherous currents of the fashion world for 3 decades. This was just another hostile takeover attempt, and I would not be liquidated. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. Elinor Vance speaking. The voice was brisk, no nonsense, and as familiar to me as my own. Elinor had been my best friend since design school and my lawyer for the past 30 years. Ellie, it's Sandra. Sandy, I was just thinking about you. How's the desert treating you? Did you finalize the fabric order from that sustainable mill in Peru? The order is in, I said, a small smile touching my lips. But that's not why I'm calling. Ellie, the vultures are circling, just like Arthur predicted. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. What did they do? The works, an ambush in my living room, bank statements, accusations of recklessness. They're talking about a conservatorship. They what? The outrage in Elinor's voice was a balm to my soul. That arrogant little pinstriped parasite. Who's their lawyer? Let me guess. David Fincher, the one who thinks a loophole is a legal philosophy. I assume so. Mark mentioned paperwork. Don't you give it a second thought, Elinor snapped. Arthur and I spent 6 months making that trust an iron fortress. He saw this coming a mile away, Sandy. He called it the post-mortem greed clause. They can't touch the capital without your explicit, notarized consent and a panel of 3 independent financial advisors agreeing you're incompetent, which you are most certainly not. They're bluffing, trying to scare you into handing over control. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made my knees weak. I had known, intellectually, that Arthur had protected me, but hearing it from Elinor made it real. They're using my spending as the excuse, I explained. The money for Oasis Haven, the travel for the new brand. They're twisting it all into a narrative of a demented old woman throwing her money away. Then we stop letting them write the story. Elinor's voice was firm, all business now. It's time. We need to accelerate the plan. How close are you to being ready to launch? 6 weeks, maybe 7. The samples are nearly perfect. Make it 4, she commanded. And it's time to get the full, updated valuation on the Synthogen portfolio. I want the official number down to the last cent. I'll make the call to the brokerage firm today. When your children see that report, their heads will spin. They think they're fighting over a puddle, Sandy. They have no idea they're standing at the edge of an ocean. I looked out the window again at the vibrant, resilient life in my garden. An ocean they're trying to put in a teacup, I murmured. Exactly. So let's get our ducks in a row. You focus on the launch. I'll handle the legal saber rattling. Let Mark and his little lawyer send their letters. They'll be buried in paperwork so deep they'll need a snorkel. You, my friend, have a collection to finish. We hung up, and for the first time all day, I felt the tight knot of anxiety in my chest begin to loosen. Elinor was right. I had been on the defensive, reacting to their attacks. It was time to go on the offensive. It wasn't just about my freedom anymore. It was about my work, my promise to Maria's women, and the final, brilliant chapter of my life that I was determined to write myself. They wanted a fight over Arthur's legacy. I would give them one. But it would be on my terms, and it would be a battle for my own. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of focused activity, a welcome antidote to the poison of my children's visit. I turned my sun-drenched studio, a room they'd always dismissed as my hobby space, into a command center. Bolts of organic Pima cotton and cruelty-free silk replaced the lazy stacks of art books. My design table, usually littered with charcoal sketches of desert flowers, was now a mosaic of fabric swatches, technical drawings, and cost analysis sheets. The quiet hum of my sewing machine became the soundtrack to my defiance. My phone, however, became a battlefield. Mark, true to form, began a campaign of attrition. He left voicemails, clipped and businesslike, informing me of deadlines to cooperate before he was forced to escalate. Chloe's approach was more insidious. She sent texts filled with old family photos. Remember this trip to Hawaii, Mom? We were all so happy. It was a transparent, cloying attempt to weaponize nostalgia, to make me feel guilty for fracturing a family that had, in truth, already been broken by their own greed for years. Jessica was the most surprising. She called one afternoon, her voice a syrupy concoction of concern. Sandra, I'm just calling to check on you. I know that conversation was difficult. I want you to know I told Mark he was being too harsh. This isn't about control, it's about care. Is it, Jessica? I asked, pausing my work pinning a sleeve onto a mannequin, because it felt a great deal like an ultimatum. Well, you have to see it from our perspective. We see the withdrawals, we see these eccentric projects you've taken on. Eccentric? The shelter, for instance. It's a noble cause, truly, but you've given them so much. There are more. Established charities that would provide a better return on your philanthropic investment. Tax benefits, a seat on the board. I had to stop her. Jessica, let me be very clear. Oasis Haven is not a philanthropic investment. It is a lifeline for women who have nowhere else to go. Its return is measured in safety, not tax receipts, and I find it fascinating that you know about my donations. There was a slight pause. Mark might have mentioned it. He was looking into the account you transferred the money to. Of course he was. My son, the financial detective, investigating my compassion as if it were a white-collar crime. It dawned on me then. The highlighted bank statements, the detailed knowledge of my spending, it wasn't just a casual glance. They had been monitoring me for months. And Jessica, with her sweet inquiries and gentle demeanor, was the spy. She was the one who would ask about a new piece of art, a weekend trip, and then report back to Mark, who would dutifully enter it into his ledger of my supposed decline. Thank you for your concern, Jessica, I said, my voice dripping with ice. But I have it on good authority that my investments are perfectly sound. You and Mark should perhaps focus on your own. I hung up before she could respond. The betrayal stung more than I expected. Mark's avarice and Chloe's emotional manipulation were familiar disappointments, but Jessica's duplicity was a fresher wound. She had used our quiet moments, our shared cups of tea, as reconnaissance missions. I pushed the anger aside and channeled it into my work. The collection, which I had named Resilience, was taking shape. It was a reflection of the desert itself, garments that were soft but strong, with clean, architectural lines that mimicked the canyons and flowing silhouettes that moved like the wind. The color palette was drawn from the landscape, the deep indigo of twilight, the fiery orange of a sunset, the pale blush of a ghost flower. This was more than just clothing. It was a statement. A declaration that beauty could be found in harsh places, that strength did not have to be loud, that a woman in the supposed winter of her life could still create something vibrant and new. One afternoon, Maria from Oasis Haven called, her voice frantic. Sandra, we have a crisis. The air conditioning unit for the whole West Wing just died. The repair company said it's a total loss. We need a new one. It's going to be over 100 degrees this weekend. The children, I don't know what to do. The quote is for $6,000. We don't have it. Don't worry, Maria, I'll handle it, I said without hesitation. But Sandra, your children, you said they were giving you trouble about the money. My children are not a factor in this, I said firmly. Email me the quote. The women and children will have air conditioning by tomorrow. I knew the moment I made the transfer, it would appear on Mark's radar like a flare in the night. It was a deliberate act of war. I was daring him to question it. I was daring him to tell me that the comfort and safety of 20 vulnerable women and children was a frivolous expense. 2 days later, Alina called. Her voice was electric. I have it, Sandy. The official valuation from Goldman Sachs on the Synthogen portfolio. Synthogen was the biotech startup Arthur had invested in 2 decades ago. He met the young founder at a conference and had been captivated by his vision for gene-based therapies. Arthur had always been a brilliant investor because he didn't just invest in companies, he invested in people. For years, it had been a line item on the financial reports, a quiet little stock that didn't do much. And, I asked, holding my breath. Arthur bought the pre-IPO stock for 50 cents a share. He bought 200,000 shares. Total investment, $100,000. I remember, I said. Mark always called it Dad. Little science fiction gamble. Well, Alina said, and I could hear the triumphant smile in her voice. The little science fiction gamble just got FDA approval for a revolutionary new cancer drug. As of the closing bell yesterday, Synthogen stock is trading at $452.14 a share. I did the math in my head, my mind struggling to process the numbers. My hand went to my chest. Sandy, are you still there? Ellie, what's the total? My voice was a whisper. Total value of your Synthogen holdings, my dear friend, she said, enunciating each word with delicious precision, is $90,428,000. I sank into my chair, the studio suddenly seeming to tilt around me. $90 million. It wasn't an ocean. It was a planet of water. The money my children were fighting over, the inheritance they thought they were protecting, was a rounding error. It was the loose change in the pocket of a giant. Arthur had never told me. He must have seen the valuation climbing over the years, but he'd kept it quiet. Perhaps he, too, had been protecting me, or perhaps he was leaving me one last, spectacular surprise. Their entire argument, I breathed, the whole premise that I'm draining the family fortune, is based on a lie, Alina finished for me. They're fighting over a few million in blue-chip stocks and real estate because they have no idea that the real treasure was hidden in plain sight all along. They saw a line item called Synthogen and dismissed it, just like they've dismissed you. A new kind of laugh bubbled up inside me, genuine this time, rich and full of glorious, breathtaking irony. My children, with all their financial acumen and obsessive oversight, had missed the $90 million elephant in the room. So, what now? I asked, a sense of dizzying freedom washing over me. Now, we let them continue to play their little game, Alina said, her voice sharp as attack. Let them send their legal letters. Let them threaten their conservatorship. We keep the ace up our sleeve. We wait until the launch. We let them walk right into the trap they've built for themselves. You, Sandra, are about to become one of the most powerful and influential independent designers in the country. And your children are about to get a master class in what a return on investment really looks like. The official letter arrived 3 days after the air conditioner was installed at Oasis Haven. It was delivered by courier, a crisp, cream-colored envelope that felt heavier than its weight in paper. The letterhead read, Fincher, Bell and Associates, Alina's predicted legal guns for hire. The language was cold, dense with legal jargon, but the message was brutally simple. It was a formal request for voluntary financial oversight, citing my recent, erratic, and significant expenditures, including a $6,000 payment to an unvetted third-party entity. It stated that if I did not agree to a meeting to sign over financial authority to my son, Mark, within 10 business days, they would be forced to petition the court for an emergency conservatorship on the grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. It was, in essence, a declaration of war. I faxed a copy to Alina's office. She called me within minutes, not with concern, but with a sound of pure, unadulterated glee. Oh, this is beautiful, Sandy. It's a masterpiece of arrogant overreach. Unvetted third-party entity. He makes a women's shelter sound like an offshore gambling site. David Fincher must be charging Mark a fortune for this garbage. We're going to have so much fun with this. So I shouldn't worry. I asked, though I already knew the answer. Worry? My dear, you should frame it. This document is a monument to their own stupidity. I'll draft a response so polite and so dismissive it'll make their heads spin. You just keep focusing on the collection. How is it coming? It's breathing, I said, looking around my studio. It truly was. The pieces hanging on the racks no longer looked like individual garments, but like a cohesive thought, a story told in fabric and thread. A key part of that story was Leo. I had found Leo Martinez through a professor at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. He was 24, bursting with talent and a raw, kinetic energy that reminded me of myself at that age. He had a brilliant eye for structure, but was still learning the nuances of textiles. I hired him as my assistant, but he quickly became a collaborator, a sounding board, and the kind of creative partner I hadn't realized how much I missed. He walked in then, carrying a stack of pattern papers and a coffee. "Morning, Sandra. The new samples for the evening coat just came in. The drape on that bamboo silk is, well, it's basically a religious experience." He unrolled the fabric, and it cascaded over the table, shimmering like liquid moonlight. Unlike my own children, Leo never looked at these materials and saw a price tag. He saw the potential, the art. "What do you think of the lapel?" he asked, folding the fabric. "I still think we could go a little sharper, a little more architectural." "No," I said, running my hand over the silk. "The softness is the point, Leo. The contrast. It's a coat that looks like armor but feels like a hug. That's the entire ethos of the brand. Resilience isn't about being hard. It's about being able to remain soft in a world that tries to break you." He looked at me, his young face full of a respect and understanding that felt like a balm on my wounded spirit. "I get it," he said quietly. "Okay, soft lapel it is." He looked at the legal letter still on my desk. More fan mail from the family? I had told Leo a sanitized version of the situation, that my children were concerned about the financial viability of the new brand. I didn't want to burden him with the ugly details. "Something like that," I said, folding the letter and putting it away. He hesitated, then said, "For what it's worth, Sandra, what you're building here. It's not just a collection, it's important. Anyone who can't see that is blind." His simple vote of confidence meant more to me than any financial statement ever could. The next attack came from Chloe, and it was far more cunning than Mark's legal bludgeon. She called a few days later, her voice bright and cheerful. "Mom, I was just thinking, we haven't had a proper mother-daughter lunch in ages. No boys, no business talk, just us. There's a new place downtown I'm dying to try. What do you say?" My treat. My guard was immediately up. Chloe never did anything without an agenda, and my treat was a glaring red flag. But Aliner's advice echoed in my head. Let them play their game. "That sounds lovely, darling," I said, matching her breezy tone. "When were you thinking?" We set a date for the following Tuesday. I chose my outfit carefully that morning. A simple but impeccably tailored white linen dress from my own collection, paired with a bold turquoise necklace. I wanted to look elegant, healthy, and completely in control. I arrived at the chic little bistro to find Chloe waiting at a patio table. But she wasn't alone. Seated next to her, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Dr. Evans, my doctor, a man I had been seeing for checkups for nearly 20 years. The pleasant lunch was a lie. This was an ambush. "Mom," Chloe said, standing to give me a kiss on the cheek. Her skin was cold. "Look who I ran into, Dr. Evans, you remember my mother." "Sandra," he said, rising awkwardly and shaking my hand. His grip was clammy. "What a coincidence." "Is it?" I said, my eyes locking with his. I didn't sit down. I looked back at Chloe, who was already starting to look flustered by my reaction. "A coincidence, that's a fascinating word for it. Let me guess, Chloe. After our lovely lunch, you were planning on telling me that you'd already booked me an appointment with Dr. Evans for a quick checkup. A cognitive assessment, perhaps." Chloe's fake smile faltered. "Mom, don't be dramatic. I'm just concerned about your health. We all are." "And you, Robert," I said, turning my full attention to the doctor, who was now avoiding my gaze. "Does your professional code of ethics include participating in family interventions disguised as social lunches? Were you planning on making a diagnosis here between the appetizer and the main course?" "Now, Sandra, that's not fair," he stammered, adjusting his tie. "Chloe and Mark. They expressed some very serious concerns about your memory, your recent impulsiveness." "My impulsiveness," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. I looked from the doctor's anxious face to my daughter's crumbling composure. My son and daughter-in-law had spied on my finances. My daughter was trying to gaslight me into a competency hearing. They weren't just vultures anymore. They were grave robbers, trying to bury me before I was even dead. The rage that had been simmering for weeks finally coalesced into something cold and clear. I would not be emotional. I would not be dramatic. I would be precise. "My memory," I said, my voice dangerously calm, is perfectly intact, Robert. For instance, I remember that you yourself told me at my last physical that I was in better health than most women 20 years my junior. I remember that Mark's son, my grandson, has a severe nut allergy, a fact Chloe seems to forget every time she brings peanut butter cookies to family gatherings. And I remember a conversation I had with my late husband, Arthur, about a particular clause in our trust. A clause that requires the opinion of 3 independent neurologists before any discussion of diminished capacity can even be entertained. So this little performance, this pathetic, transparent attempt to intimidate an old woman, it is not only insulting, it is legally irrelevant. I let the words hang in the stunned silence. Dr. Evans looked horrified. Chloe looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. I gave them one last, withering look. "Enjoy your lunch," I said. Then I turned and walked away, leaving them in the wreckage of their failed conspiracy. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had just won another battle, and they had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. Walking away from the bistro, I felt a strange and exhilarating sense of lightness. The desert air, usually so heavy with heat, felt crisp and clean. They had played their hand, a clumsy, desperate move, and they had lost. I hadn't just dodged a bullet, I had captured their entire arsenal. Chloe's stunt with Dr. Evans wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a tactical blunder of epic proportions. As soon as I got back to my car, I called Alina. "Ellie," I said, not even bothering with a greeting. "You are not going to believe the level of sheer, unadulterated stupidity I have just witnessed." I recounted the entire fiasco at the bistro, Chloe's fake invitation, the coincidental appearance of Dr. Evans, my final surgical dismantling of their little plot. Alina was silent for a moment, and then I heard a sound of pure delight. "Oh, she did not," Alina exclaimed. "She tried to pull a competency ambush with your own GP? Sandy, this is better than I could have hoped. This isn't just them bluffing anymore, this is them showing the court exactly how they operate, with manipulation and bad faith. Did you get any of it on tape?" "Hardly," I said. But the look on his face when I mentioned the 3 independent neurologists' clause was worth 1,000 photographs. "He knew he was crossing a line," Alina said, her voice turning serious. "And he let your children push him over it. This is useful, Sandy, very useful. I'm going to draft a letter to Dr. Evans' office, just a gentle inquiry about his presence at the lunch and a reminder of his confidentiality obligations under HIPAA. It won't be a threat, just a friendly professional reminder. It will be enough to ensure he never participates in their games again." The following days were a period of intense, focused creation. Freed from the immediate threat of their legal and emotional attacks, I poured all my energy into the final stages of the Resilience collection. Leo and I worked from dawn until long after the desert stars appeared. We debated the weight of a hem, the precise angle of a shoulder seam, the way a certain fabric caught the light. It was exhausting, meticulous work, but it was honest. It was real. One evening, Leo stayed late to help me organize the final lookbook photos. He was quiet, more so than usual. "Something on your mind, Leo?" I asked as we pinned photographs to a large corkboard. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My mother, she used to design. Not professionally like you. She made clothes for us for the neighbors. She had a little sewing room in our house, filled with scraps of fabric. It was her happy place." I stopped what I was doing and gave him my full attention. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," he said, a sad smile touching his lips. "When my father lost his job, things got tight. He told her the sewing was a waste of money, a foolish extravagance. He made her sell her machine." Leo's voice was thick with an old pain. "She never really recovered from that. It was like a light went out inside her. He didn't just take her hobby, he took a part of her soul." He looked at me, his eyes shining with a fierce loyalty. "When I see what you're doing here, Sandra, fighting for this, creating all this beauty when people are telling you to stop, it feels like you're doing it for her too, and I just wanted to say thank you." His words struck a chord deep within me. He saw. He understood that this wasn't about money or fashion. It was about the fundamental right to create, to have a purpose, to refuse to be diminished. His mother's story was a quiet tragedy, a fate I was determined to avoid. The 10-day deadline from Fincher, Bell, and Associates came and went. In response to their threatening letter, Alina had sent a single-page reply that was a masterwork of legal disdain. It acknowledged receipt of their letter, politely declined their generous offer of oversight, and respectfully reminded them of the specific multi-layered legal barriers to any involuntary conservatorship, citing the exact articles and clauses in Arthur's trust. It was the legal equivalent of a serene smile and a closed door. We heard nothing back. The silence was telling. Their bluff had been called, but I knew Mark and Chloe wouldn't give up. They would simply change tactics. The next assault came in a form I hadn't anticipated. It came through my grandson. Chloe called me on a Saturday morning. Her voice was strained. "Mom, it's about Thomas. He's not doing well." Thomas was Mark and Jessica's 10-year-old son, a bright, sensitive boy I adored. My heart immediately clenched. "What is it? Is he sick? Is it his allergy?" No, nothing like that," she said quickly. "It's school. His grades are slipping. He's been getting into fights. His teacher called. She said he seems angry, anxious." "And what does this have to do with me?" I asked, though I was already beginning to dread the answer. Chloe took a deep, theatrical breath. "He overhears things, Mom. He knows there's tension in the family. He heard Mark on the phone talking about the finances, about how worried he is for your future. Mark is so stressed, and Thomas feels it. Jessica says the boy asked her if his grandma was going to lose her house. It was a masterstroke of cruelty, their most despicable move yet. They were using my own grandson, a child, as a pawn. They were poisoning him with their manufactured anxieties and then blaming me for his distress." "That is a lie, Chloe," I said, my voice shaking with a rage that eclipsed everything I had felt before. "You are lying to your own nephew. You are filling a child's head with fear to try and manipulate his grandmother. Have you no shame? Have you no soul?" "It's not a lie," she insisted, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Mark is worried. We all are. This is what we've been trying to tell you. Your actions have consequences that affect everyone, even the children." I thought of Thomas, of his sweet, open face, now clouded with a worry that no 10-year-old should ever have to bear. They were hurting him. They were hurting a child to get to my money. That was the moment the last shred of my affection for them, the lingering, stubborn hope that somewhere beneath the greed they were still the children I had raised, finally died. It turned to ash and blew away on the hot desert wind. "I want to speak to him," I said, my voice flat and cold. "What? Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. He's very fragile right now." "Put Thomas on the phone, Chloe. Or so help me God, the next person you and your brother hear from will not be my lawyer, but an investigator from Child Protective Services. I wonder what they would think of parents who intentionally inflict emotional distress on a child for financial gain." There was a choked sound of disbelief on the other end of the line, followed by a muffled, frantic conversation. After a moment, a small, hesitant voice came on. "Grandma," my heart broke. "Hello, my darling boy," I said, forcing a warmth into my voice that I did not feel. "Your Aunt Chloe tells me you're worried about me." "Are you okay, Grandma?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Dad said you're spending all of Grandpa's money and you might have to move." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "Oh, sweetheart, that is absolutely not true. Your grandfather was a very, very smart man, and he made sure I would be safe and sound in this house for the rest of my life. And the money, it's not disappearing. It's being planted. Like seeds, I'm starting a new garden of a sorts. It takes a lot of seeds and a lot of water to get a new garden started, but soon it's going to grow into something big and beautiful. Do you understand?" "I think so," he whispered. "I want you to promise me something, Thomas," I said gently. "When you hear the grown-ups talking about grown-up things, I want you to cover your ears and hum your favorite song as loud as you can, because their worries are not your worries. Your only job is to be a happy 10-year-old boy. Can you do that for me?" "Okay, Grandma," he said, and I could hear the smile returning to his voice. "I love you very much. I love you too." I hung up the phone, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, I wept. I wept not for myself, but for the little boy they were willing to sacrifice on the altar of their greed. And in those tears, my last hesitation was washed away. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a rescue mission. I had to rescue my grandson's peace of mind, I had to rescue the women at the shelter, and I had to rescue myself. The launch of the Resilience Collection was no longer just a business debut. It was going to be a day of reckoning. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat. The tears dried, but the cold fury remained. It settled deep in my bones, a core of steel I hadn't known I possessed. The incident with Thomas was a clarifying fire. They had stripped away all pretense of love or concern, revealing the raw, ugly mechanics of their greed. And in doing so, they had given me a gift, the freedom of no longer having to care what they thought. My only allegiance now was to the truth. I called a leaner. "Change of plans," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "The launch party is no longer just a launch party, it's a public hearing, and I'm going to be the judge, the jury, and the star witness." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her tone instantly alert. I told her about Chloe's call, about them using Thomas. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, and when she finally spoke, her voice was glacial. "I see," she said. "So the gloves are off, completely. All right, Sandra, we play it your way. Public, loud, I'll start making calls. We'll need a bigger venue. And a publicist, a shark, I know just the woman." Within 48 hours, the plan had transformed. My initial idea of a small, intimate showing for a few key buyers and fashion journalists was scrapped. Eleanor, true to her word, hired a publicist named Zara Chen, a formidable woman who moved through the world with the speed and precision of a hummingbird. Zara didn't just book a venue. She secured the main ballroom at the Parker Palm Springs, a hotel synonymous with modern Hollywood glamour. She didn't just send out invitations. She crafted a press release that was a masterpiece of intrigue, hinting at the return of a legendary design icon with a revolutionary new concept in sustainable luxury and a major philanthropic announcement. "We're not just selling clothes, Sandra," Zara told me during our first meeting, her eyes scanning my studio with an appraising glint. "We're selling a narrative, your narrative, the comeback, the triumph over adversity. The press will eat it up. But we need a hook." "Oh, don't you worry," I said with a grim smile. "I have a hook." Of course, Mark and Chloe received an invitation. It was hand-delivered, printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. It was not a request, but a summons. I knew they wouldn't be able to resist. Their curiosity and their sense of entitlement would compel them to attend. They would walk into that ballroom expecting to witness the final, embarrassing fizzle of their mother's folly. They had no idea they were walking onto a stage I was setting just for them. In the midst of the whirlwind of launch preparations, I continued my real work. The trips my children had so despised became more frequent, but now they were purposeful sprints. I flew to San Francisco to meet with a venture capital firm run by women, presenting my business plan for the Resilience brand. They were captivated not by my history, but by my future-focused vision of sustainability and ethical production. They saw the market I was targeting, women of my generation, with significant disposable income, who were tired of being ignored by an industry obsessed with youth. They saw the value in a brand that wasn't just about looking good, but about doing good. On another trip, I flew to New York, but not to shop. I met with the board of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I walked them through the financials of Oasis Haven, showing them the impact that consistent, private funding could have. I laid out a proposal for a new model of philanthropy, one based not on galas and public pledges, but on quiet, sustained support. These were the trips they had tracked, the expenses they had condemned. They saw an old woman on a spending spree. The world was about to see a titan of industry building a new kind of empire, one founded on compassion and fueled by a $90 million secret. Jessica was the first to try and get information. She sent a text. "Heard about the big party, Sandra. It sounds fabulous. Mark and I are so thrilled you're putting yourself out there. What's the big philanthropic announcement all about? We're dying to know." The casual, fishing tone was insulting. I replied with a single sentence. "I'll have to wait and see, just like everyone else." As the day of the launch approached, a strange calm settled over me. Leo, who was now working nearly around the clock, was a bundle of nerves and excitement. "The editor of Vogue is confirmed, Sandra. Vogue, and I just got a call from a stylist for Julia Roberts. They want to see the lookbook." "That's wonderful, Leo," I said, calmly adjusting a seam on the final piece, a show-stopping evening gown the color of a desert dusk. "You're not freaking out?" He asked, his eyes wide. "I'm freaking out. Leo," I said, turning to him, "this collection is the truest thing I have ever designed. The materials are honest. The labor was ethical. The vision is clear. There is nothing to be nervous about when you are telling the truth. All we have to do now is turn on the lights." The night of the launch, the ballroom at the Parker was electric. The air buzzed with the chatter of 150 of the most influential people in fashion, finance, and philanthropy. I saw heads of industry, powerful journalists, even a few famous faces who had been loyal clients of mine decades ago. Zara had worked her magic. This wasn't just a party, it was an event. I watched from the wings as the guests arrived. I saw Mark, Chloe, and Jessica enter. They looked slightly bewildered, out of their depth. This was not the pathetic little craft show they had imagined. This was a major league affair. They found a table near the back, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. They huddled together, whispering, their eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of a reality that didn't align with their carefully constructed narrative of my decline. Finally, Zara gave me the cue. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A single spotlight hit the runway. The music, a haunting, minimalist piece, began to play. I stepped onto the stage, not in one of my own designs, but in a simple, elegant black dress. I wanted them to see me, not the clothes. The room fell silent. I looked out at the sea of faces and my eyes found my children. I saw their shock, their disbelief that I was the one in command. "Good evening," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. "And thank you for being here. For many years, I have been a private person, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. Some of you may remember a life I had before that as a designer. Tonight, I am here to reintroduce myself, not as who I was, but as who I am." I paused, letting my gaze sweep the room before it landed once more on my children. We are often told that a woman's life has seasons, that there is a time for ambition and a time for quiet retirement, a time to be seen and a time to become invisible. Tonight, I am here to tell you that is a lie. The last few months have been a time of profound change for me. After losing my husband, I found myself being defined by others. I was told I was fragile. I was told I was reckless. I was told my judgment was failing. I was told my resources were dwindling and that my future should be placed in the hands of others for my own protection. I could see Mark shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Jessica was staring at her water glass. Chloe was frozen, her face pale. But what my loving protectors failed to see, I continued, my voice gaining strength, was that I wasn't dwindling. I was investing. I wasn't spending. I was building. They saw charges from boutiques and called it extravagance. They didn't see the prototypes for a new, sustainable line of clothing designed for women who, like me, refused to be invisible. They saw airline tickets and called it recklessness. They didn't see the meetings with investors and suppliers who believe in that vision. They saw large cash withdrawals and called it foolishness. They had no idea that money was providing a new roof, new plumbing, and a new sense of security for a local shelter for women and children fleeing violence. A murmur went through the crowd. I saw Maria, seated in the front row with the board of Oasis, Haven, wipe a tear from her eye. "And most significantly," I said, my voice ringing with clarity, "they saw a dwindling inheritance." They looked at my late husband's portfolio, the one they were so desperate to protect, and they completely overlooked his single greatest investment, a little science fiction gamble he made 20 years ago. I looked directly at Mark. His face had gone ashen. They missed it. Because in their rush to declare me incompetent, they proved only their own. Tonight, I am pleased to announce two things. First, the official valuation of that little gamble, a biotech company called Synthogen, is now over $90 million. The room erupted in gasps. I saw Mark physically recoil as if he'd been struck. Chloe's mouth had fallen open. Jessica looked like she was going to faint. "And second," I said, my voice soaring over the stunned silence, "the launch of my new brand, Resilience. Let's see the clothes." The music swelled, the lights flared, and the first model walked onto the runway. The show had begun. The models moved down the runway like goddesses of the desert. Each garment was a testament to the brand's name. There were flowing caftans in the colors of the sunrise, tailored trousers in earthy ochre that spoke of quiet strength, and jackets with sharp, clean lines that seemed carved from the canyons themselves. The fabrics, all sustainable and ethically sourced, moved with a grace that silenced the room. This was not the work of a woman in decline. This was the work of a master at the peak of her powers. I watched, not from the wings, but from a chair placed at the side of the stage. I wanted to see every reaction. I saw the rapt attention on the faces of the fashion editors, the quick, scribbled notes of the buyers, the appreciative nods from the philanthropists. And I saw my children. They were no longer whispering. They were utterly still, trapped in the glare of a truth so blinding it had struck them dumb. The $90 million revelation had shattered their reality. Everything they thought they knew, every justification for their actions, had been built on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. The final piece was the dusk-colored evening gown. It was worn by a model in her late 60s, a stunning woman with silver hair and a grace that commanded the stage. As she made her final turn, the audience rose to its feet in a wave of thunderous applause. It wasn't just for the clothes, it was for the story, for the defiance, for the sheer, unmitigated triumph of it all. I stepped back to the microphone, letting the applause wash over me before holding up a hand for silence. "The Resilience collection is more than just clothing," I said, my voice resonating with a new authority. "It is a promise, a promise that style does not have an age limit and that purpose does not have an expiration date. It is also a vehicle for change. I beckoned to the side of the stage, and Maria, the director of Oasis Haven, walked out to join me. I took her hand. "This is Maria Reyes," I announced. "She is the director of Oasis Haven, a shelter that provides a vital sanctuary for women and children in our community. For the past 5 years, I have been a quiet supporter of their work, an investment my children recently deemed erratic." A few knowing, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. Tonight, I am making that support public. I am pleased to announce the formation of the Laurent Foundation. Its first act will be to purchase the building that Oasis Haven currently leases, securing its future permanently. Furthermore, I continued, my voice ringing with passion, 10% of all profits from the Resilience brand will be donated directly to the foundation to establish a national network of similar shelters, creating safe havens for women across the country. The applause was even louder this time, a roar of genuine approval and excitement. Maria was openly weeping beside me, her hand clutching mine. "But the foundation will not be funded by the clothing brand alone," I said, and the room fell silent again in anticipation. "It will be funded by the $90 million my children were so eager to protect. Effective immediately, I am transferring the entirety of my Syntho-Gen holdings into a charitable trust to endow the Laurent Foundation. The money they were so worried I would squander on myself will now be used to give thousands of women the one thing my own family tried to take from me, a chance to live a life of independence, free from fear and control." It was the final, devastating blow. I had not just removed the money from their reach, I had consecrated it to a cause that stood in stark opposition to their own values. I had transformed their inheritance into a symbol of their failure. I looked at their table. Mark was staring at me, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. Jessica was frantically texting on her phone, no doubt communicating with their lawyer, who was hopefully having a very bad night. And Chloe was crying. But they were not the soft, manipulative tears I was used to. They were the hard, ragged sobs of someone whose entire world has just been publicly and irrevocably dismantled. The event wrapped up in a flurry of congratulations and flashing cameras. Buyers were placing orders. Journalists were clamoring for interviews. Philanthropists were pledging their support for the new foundation. I was surrounded by a sea of well-wishers, people who saw me, who understood what I was doing and why. Through it all, I felt a sense of profound, quiet clarity. There was no joy in my children's public humiliation, only a grim sense of necessity. I had not done this to hurt them, but to stop them from hurting anyone else, including themselves. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Alina and Leo found me. Alina's eyes were shining. "Sandy, that was more than a launch, that was a coronation. Arthur would have been so damn proud." Leo, usually so talkative, was speechless. He simply threw his arms around me in a fierce, heartfelt hug. "You did it, Sandra," he whispered. "You really did it." As he pulled away, I saw them, my family. They were standing near the exit, a small, isolated island in the dispersing crowd. They were waiting for me. This was it, the final confrontation. "I'll be right back," I said to Alina and Leo. I walked towards them, my steps even and unhurried. The space around us seemed to clear, the remaining guests sensing the tension and giving us a wide berth. Mark spoke first, his voice a low, venomous hiss. How could you do that to us? In public, humiliating us, giving away our money." "It was never your money, Mark," I said, my voice calm. "That was the delusion you've been operating under. It was Arthur's money, and now it's mine. And I have chosen to do something meaningful with it." "Meaningful?" he scoffed, his face contorted with rage. "You call throwing it away on strangers meaningful? That was our legacy, our children's legacy." "Your children's legacy will be the character you and your wife instill in them," I said, my gaze shifting to Jessica, who flinched but didn't look up from her phone. "It will be the lessons you teach them about integrity, compassion, and respect." Judging by recent events, I'd say that legacy is in serious jeopardy. I then turned to Chloe, whose tear-streaked face was a mess of confusion and pain. "And you, Chloe, using your own nephew, trying to convince me I was losing my mind. Was any of it worth it?" She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading question. "Why didn't you just tell us?" she whispered. "About the money, the brand, all of it. Why did you let us become this?" It was the first honest question any of them had asked me in months, and it deserved an honest answer. "Because," I said, and the truth of it settled in my heart with a painful weight. "You never asked." I let that sink in. "You didn't ask me how I was coping after your father died. You didn't ask me what my dreams were for the rest of my life. You didn't ask me what I was passionate about. You didn't come to me with questions, you came to me with accusations. You didn't offer help, you issued ultimatums. You didn't see a mother to be loved, you saw a balance sheet to be controlled. I didn't tell you because you had made it abundantly clear that you weren't interested in my truth. You were only interested in my assets. My words hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. There was no defense against them because they were the simple truth. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of unspoken resentments and missed opportunities. Jessica was the first to break it, though she didn't speak to me. She tugged on Mark's arm, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. "Mark, let's go, there's nothing more to say here. Our lawyer will be in touch." Her reaction was telling. Even now, faced with the complete collapse of their narrative, her instinct was not reflection but litigation. She saw this not as a family tragedy, but as a lost lawsuit. Mark looked at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying to behold. It was the impotent rage of a man who has been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and publicly exposed. He had built his identity on being the smart one, the one in control, and I had revealed him to be a fool. "You will regret this," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You've made a spectacle of this family. You've disinherited your own grandchildren. You've chosen strangers over your own blood." "Blood is not a license for cruelty, Mark," I replied, my own voice softening, not with forgiveness, but with a profound and weary sadness. "And family is not an entitlement program. It's a relationship, one that you and Chloe and Jessica have systematically dismantled. As for my grandchildren, they will not be disinherited. The foundation I've established will change the world for the better. It will build them a legacy of compassion and strength, a far greater inheritance than a trust fund ever could be. They will grow up knowing their grandmother stood for something." I turned my gaze to Chloe, who was still weeping, but her sobs had quieted. She was looking at me now, not with anger, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. It was as if she was seeing their collective actions clearly for the very first time, not as justifiable means to an end, but as the ugly, selfish betrayals they truly were. She started, her voice breaking. I never meant for." "I know what you meant, Chloe," I said gently. "You meant for it to be easy. You meant for me to quietly sign the papers, to fade into the background, to become a manageable problem. You never meant for me to fight back. You never meant for me to be strong. You underestimated me, and that was your greatest mistake." Without another word, Mark turned and strode towards the exit, pulling a stunned Jessica with him. Chloe hesitated, her eyes locked on mine, filled with a chaotic storm of regret and shame. For a fleeting moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would run to me with a scraped knee, seeking comfort and reassurance. But that little girl was gone, and the woman who stood in her place was a stranger to me. She gave a final, choked sob and turned to follow her brother. I stood alone in the now nearly empty ballroom, the remnants of my triumph scattered around me: empty glasses, discarded napkins, the lingering scent of perfume and success. But I felt no elation. Only a deep, hollow ache. I had won. I had protected myself, secured my legacy, and launched a new future, but I had lost my children. Perhaps, I realized with a pang of clarity, I had lost them long ago, and tonight was simply the funeral. Alina appeared at my side, a glass of champagne in her hand. She pressed it into mine. "Don't," she said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "Don't feel a shred of guilt. You didn't do this to them, Sandy. They did it to themselves. You just turned on the lights." I took a sip of the champagne. It was cold and crisp, but I could barely taste it. "It still hurts, Ellie." "Of course it does," she said, putting an arm around my shoulders. "But tonight something else was born. Look around." She gestured across the room. Leo was talking excitedly with a buyer from Neiman Marcus. Zara was deep in conversation with a journalist from Women's Wear Daily. And Maria was standing with two other women from the board of Oasis Haven, their faces alight with a hope that was so bright it was almost tangible. "That," Alina said, her voice firm, "is your real family, the one you chose. The one you built, the one that will build a better world alongside you. The past is done. Let's drink to the future." I looked at the scene, at the new relationships forged in trust and mutual respect, at the incredible potential for good that had been set in motion. Alina was right. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. I raised my glass. "To the future," I said, and this time I meant it. The aftermath of the launch was a whirlwind. The story, as Zara had predicted, became a media sensation. The narrative was irresistible. The iconic designer, underestimated by her greedy children, who stages a spectacular comeback, revealing a secret fortune that she then dedicates to philanthropy. I was on the cover of magazines. I was interviewed for television specials. The Resilience collection sold out its first run in less than a week. Through it all, I kept my focus. I worked with Alina to finalize the legal structure of the Laurent Foundation. I worked with Maria to purchase the shelter building and plan for its expansion. I worked with Leo to scale up production for the brand, ensuring our ethical and sustainable standards were maintained at every step. I received a single, formal letter from a new lawyer representing Mark, Chloe, and Jessica. It stated that they would not be contesting the formation of the charitable trust. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of their actions, just a cold, legal surrender. Their war was over because they had run out of ammunition and had no ground left to stand on. A few weeks after the launch, I was in my studio, sketching ideas for the next collection, when I received an unexpected visitor. It was Thomas, my grandson. He was standing in the doorway, holding a small, clumsily wrapped package. Behind him, looking nervous and uncertain, was his mother, Jessica. It was the first time I had seen any of them since that night. "He insisted on coming," Jessica said, her voice barely a whisper. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "He wanted to give you this." I knelt down to Thomas's level. "Hello, my love," I said softly. He held out the gift. "I made it for you, Grandma." I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small, hand-painted clay pot. It was a little lopsided, the paint slightly smeared, but in the center he had painted a single, vibrant pink flower, a desert rose. "It's for your new garden," he said. "When you told me about." Tears sprang to my eyes, the one pure, honest thing in this entire ugly affair. He had listened. He had understood. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," I told him, my voice thick with emotion. "I will treasure it always." I gave him a long hug, and he squeezed me back with all his might. When I looked up, I finally met Jessica's gaze. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and for the first time, I saw not calculation or malice, but a flicker of genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Sandra," she whispered, and the words seemed to cost her a great deal. "For everything." It wasn't a full confession. It wasn't a detailed accounting of her betrayals. But it was a start. It was a crack in the wall of denial they had built around themselves. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was, perhaps, the first seed of a new kind of garden, one that might, with a great deal of time and care, one day bloom. I held Jessica's gaze for a long moment, letting her apology, however fragile, settle in the space between us. The anger that had been my constant companion for months had cooled, leaving behind a vast, quiet landscape of sorrow. I saw in her face not a villain, but a woman who had made a series of terrible choices, tethering her own worth to her husband's ambition and losing herself in the process. "Thank you for bringing him, Jessica," I said, my voice even. It was all I could offer. It was not an absolution, but an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that she had, in this one small moment, chosen her son's needs over her own pride. She gave a short, jerky nod, her composure crumbling. She seemed to want to say more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just watched as I stood up, taking Thomas's hand. "Would you like to see the real garden, sweetheart?" I asked him. "The one Grandpa built for me?" His face lit up. "Yes." I led him out to the patio, leaving Jessica standing alone in the entryway. We walked through the garden paths, and I pointed out the different flowers and plants. I told him the names of the hummingbirds that frequented the feeders. I showed him the spot where a family of quail nested every spring. I was reintroducing him to a world of simple, honest beauty, a world away from the hushed, anxious conversations he had been forced to overhear. As we sat on a stone bench, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the San Jacinto Mountains, he turned to me with the profound seriousness only a child can possess. "Are Dad and Aunt Chloe still mad at you?" he asked. The question was a tiny, perfect spear, piercing straight to the heart of the matter. I chose my words with the utmost care. "Sometimes, darling, grown-ups get their maps all wrong. They think the treasure is buried in one place, and they get very angry when they dig and find nothing but dirt. They get so focused on the map, they forget to look at the beautiful world all around them. Your dad and your aunt, I think they're still angry at the map. I hope one day they'll look up and see the world instead." He seemed to ponder this. "I like the world better than maps," he decided. "Me too," I said, squeezing his hand. "Me too." When I brought him back inside, Jessica was still there, perched on the edge of the white linen sofa where she had once sat to condemn me. She looked small and lost in the grand room. "He's a wonderful boy, Jessica," I said. "He has his grandfather's kind heart." Tears welled in her eyes again. "I know," she whispered. "Mark, he's not taking this well. He's talking about moving, leaving California. He says there's nothing for him here anymore." Perhaps a change would be good for him, I said, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. I would not be drawn back into their drama, into the role of matriarchal problem solver. Their choices were their own. They had dug their hole, I would not be the one to lift them out. He blames you for everything, she said, almost to herself. But it's not you, it's all of it. The pressure. He's been chasing something his whole life, and last month he realized it was a ghost. It was the most insightful thing I had ever heard her say. She was right. Mark had spent his life chasing Arthur's approval, trying to measure up to a man whose success he measured only in dollars, never in character. The $90 million revelation hadn't just been a financial shock, it had been an existential one. It proved that his father's greatest success was in a realm of risk and vision that Mark, with his cautious, ledger-based view of the world, could never have comprehended. He hadn't just lost an inheritance, he had lost the race he'd been running against his father's ghost. After they left, I placed Thomas's little clay pot on the windowsill in my studio, right next to the photograph of Arthur and me in Paris. The lopsided hand-painted flower next to the image of our shared joy. The future and the past, side by side, a reminder of what was lost and what still remained. The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of work, a joyful, purpose-driven momentum. The Laurent Foundation was no longer an idea, it was a humming, functioning entity. I assembled a board of directors, not of socialites and billionaires, but of fierce, brilliant women, a retired judge, a financial literacy advocate, an expert in trauma-informed care. Maria was, of course, a founding member. Our first official act was a quiet one. We didn't hold a press conference. We simply paid off the mortgage on the Oasis Haven building. The day Maria called me, her voice breaking with the news that the deed was in their name, free and clear forever, was 100 times more satisfying than the applause on the night of the launch. I also found a new rhythm in my own life. I woke with the sun, spent the mornings in my garden, and the afternoons in my studio. But now, my design work felt different. It was unburdened. I was no longer designing to prove a point, but for the sheer joy of creation. Leo, who I had promoted to head designer, brought a fresh, exciting energy to the brand, while I took on the role of creative director, guiding the vision, mentoring his talent. We were building something to last. One afternoon, I was at Oasis Haven, watching as a new playground was installed in the backyard, a gift from the foundation. Children's laughter filled the air, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. Maria came and stood beside me. "Look at that," she said, her eyes shining. "That is the sound of your legacy, Sandra." I thought of Mark's bitter accusation that I had chosen strangers over my own blood. I looked at the children playing, at the women sitting together on the porch, sharing stories, finding strength in each other's company. These were not strangers. They were a community I had helped to nurture. This was not a rejection of family, but a redefinition of it. Family was not just about the blood you shared, but about the lives you chose to lift up. A few months later, I received a letter. It was postmarked from Asheville, North Carolina. The handwriting was Chloe. My first instinct was to throw it away, to not let her words, whatever they might be, disturb the peace I had worked so hard to build. But curiosity, or perhaps some lingering, vestigial maternal instinct, made me open it. The letter was long, several pages written on simple, unadorned paper. It was not the letter I expected. There were no excuses, no justifications. It was simply an apology. "Dear Mom," it began, "I don't know if you'll even read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. There are no words to undo what I did. I have been replaying that lunch, my phone calls, everything over and over in my head. And all I can see is a person I don't recognize, a person I am deeply, profoundly ashamed of." She wrote about how, after the launch, she had felt her world collapse. She had left her husband, a man, I now learned, who had been pushing her to secure the inheritance to fund his own failing business ventures. She had moved across the country to get away from it all, from Mark's relentless anger and Jessica's silent judgment. She had taken a simple job at a bookstore. "For the first time in my life," she wrote, "I am earning my own money. It's not much, but it's mine. I'm living in a tiny apartment, and I'm taking a class in pottery at the local community college. I am covered in clay most days, and I have never been happier. I think for my whole life, I was performing a part I thought everyone wanted me to play, the perfect daughter, the perfect wife. I was so busy performing that I forgot to have a self. I see now that my attempts to control your life were a reflection of how little control I felt I had over my own. I don't expect you to forgive me. I haven't forgiven myself. But I wanted you to know that the lesson you taught me that night, as painful as it was a lesson I desperately needed to learn. You showed me what a strong, independent woman looks like, and you have, in a strange and painful way, given me the courage to try and become one myself. I hope one day I can earn back the privilege of being your daughter. Until then, I will simply try to be a woman you would not be ashamed of." I folded the letter and held it to my chest. The tears that came were not tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of a complex, bittersweet release. It was not a reunion. It was not a neat and tidy ending. But it was a beginning. A single, fragile shoot of green in a scorched and barren field. She had finally stopped looking at the map. She was, at last, looking up at the world. Chloe's letter became a quiet touchstone for me in the months that followed. It was not a promise of reconciliation, but evidence of something far more profound: the possibility of change. It affirmed the difficult choice I had made. By refusing to enable their destructive behavior, I had, in a way, forced Chloe to confront the emptiness of her own life, creating the space for her to begin building a genuine self. It was a harsh form of love, a controlled burn to allow for new growth, but perhaps it was the only form of love that could have reached her. I didn't write back immediately. Her journey was her own, and I knew that my immediate forgiveness might feel like an unearned rescue, pulling her back into a dynamic of seeking my approval. She needed to do this for herself, not for me, so I waited. I let her words settle, and I focused on my own new life, a life that was becoming richer and more fulfilling than I could have imagined. The Laurent Foundation flourished. We didn't just fund shelters, we created programs. We launched a financial literacy course for the residents of Oasis Haven, taught by a volunteer from the board. We started a mentorship program, pairing women from the shelter with female executives and entrepreneurs in the community. We were not just providing a safe harbor, we were building a launchpad. One of our most successful initiatives was a vocational training program within the Resilience brand itself. We hired several women from the shelter, training them in pattern making, sewing, and quality control. Their presence in the atelier brought a new depth and meaning to our work. They were not just employees, they were living embodiments of the brand's name. Seeing a woman who had arrived at the shelter with nothing but the clothes on her back now skillfully operating a complex sewing machine, her face a mask of concentration and pride, was a greater reward than any magazine cover. My relationship with Leo also deepened. He was more than an employee or a collaborator, he had become family. The family I chose. He and his partner would come to my home for dinner on Sundays. We would talk for hours about art, life, and the future of the brand. He brought youth and laughter back into the quiet corners of my house. He saw me not as a matriarch or an icon, but as a friend and a mentor. With him, I was simply Sandra, a woman who still had ideas, who still had something to contribute. Nearly a year after the launch, I was invited to give the keynote address at the annual conference for the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. The event was in New York. I decided it was time. I wrote a short, simple letter to Chloe's address in Asheville. "My dearest Chloe," I wrote, "thank you for your letter. I am proud of the woman you are becoming. I will be in New York next month. I have enclosed a ticket. If you are ready, I would love for you to be there. Not for me, but for yourself. Love, Mom." I didn't know if she would come. I had to be at peace with either outcome. But a week before the conference, I received a text. It was a picture of a train ticket to New York. Beneath it were 3 simple words: "See you there." The night of the keynote, the ballroom was filled with hundreds of advocates, survivors, and policymakers. It was a room brimming with strength and purpose. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, I saw her. Chloe was sitting in the 3rd row, dressed simply, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked nervous, but she also looked solid, grounded. She met my eyes and gave me a small, tremulous smile. I began my speech. I didn't talk about fashion or finance. I talked about the insidious nature of control. I talked about how abuse is not always physical, that it can be the slow, methodical erosion of a person's confidence, their independence, their very sense of self. I told the story of a woman I knew, a woman who had spent years being told she was fragile, incapable, and reckless, until she almost started to believe it. But resilience, I said, my voice ringing through the hall, is not the absence of scars. It is the refusal to let those scars define you. It is the quiet, stubborn, and sometimes terrifying act of reclaiming your own story. It is waking up one day and deciding to turn on the lights, even if you're afraid of what you might see. I spoke about the work of the foundation, about the incredible courage of the women at Oasis Haven, about our belief that providing safety is only the first step. The true goal is providing the tools for a self-sufficient, self-determined future. We are not in the business of saving victims, I concluded. We are in the business of empowering survivors, and the most powerful tool we can give any woman is the belief in her own worth, her own strength, and her own glorious, unbreakable resilience. The room rose in a standing ovation. As the applause thundered, my eyes found Chloe again. She was on her feet, clapping, tears streaming down her face. But for the first time in a very long time, I knew they were tears of pride. After the speech, we met in the quiet of the hotel lobby. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic apologies. The healing had already begun, quietly in the letters we had exchanged, in the choices she had made, in the mutual respect that was beginning to form a fragile bridge between us. "I brought you something," she said, pulling a small, carefully wrapped object from her bag. It was a small, beautifully crafted ceramic bowl. The glaze was a deep, iridescent blue, the color of a twilight sky. It was imperfect, organic, and breathtakingly beautiful. "It's the first piece I made that I was proud of," she said, her voice soft. I took it from her, my fingers tracing its smooth, cool surface. It felt solid, real. "It's exquisite, Chloe. I'm thinking of trying to sell them," she said, a shy but genuine smile on her face. "At the local market, it's a start." "It's a wonderful start," I said. We sat together for a long time, drinking tea, talking not about the painful past, but about the hopeful future. We talked about her pottery, about my next collection, about Thomas, who was now thriving. We talked like two women who were just getting to know each other. And in a way, we were. I knew this was not a fairy tale ending. The deep wounds of the past would leave scars. My relationship with Mark remained a silent, empty space. Perhaps some things could never be mended. But sitting there with my daughter, seeing the strong, creative, independent woman she was becoming, I understood the profound truth of my own message. Resilience wasn't about erasing the past. It was about having the courage to build a new future, piece by piece, from the beautiful, imperfect fragments of what remains. My story was no longer about a battle I had won, but about the peace I had found. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not only survived, but thrived. I had transformed their greed into grace, their cruelty into compassion. I had lost an inheritance and gained a purpose. And I had learned that the most valuable thing a person can possess is not a portfolio, but a life of their own making, a life lived with integrity, courage, and a fierce, unyielding, and beautiful resilience. The 2 years that followed my speech in New York were not a whirlwind, but a settling. The initial explosion of media attention and public interest calmed, leaving behind the sturdy, foundational reality of the life I had built. The noise receded, and in its place was the steady, rhythmic sound of meaningful work. The Resilience brand grew, not by chasing trends, but by staying true to its core principles. We became a quiet leader in the sustainable luxury market, our success a testament to the idea that ethics and elegance could coexist. My life settled into a beautiful, purposeful routine, each day a quiet affirmation of the choices I had made. My relationship with Chloe blossomed in this new, tranquil environment. She moved from Asheville to a small bungalow in the arts district of Palm Desert, a short drive from my home. Her pottery business, Blue Hour Ceramics, had found a devoted local following. Her pieces, with their deep, complex glazes and organic forms, were reflections of their creator, beautiful, imperfect, and forged in fire. She became a regular presence at the foundation, not just as my daughter, but as a valued partner. We were in the early stages of planning our most ambitious project yet, the Resilience Hub. The hub was my grand vision, the culmination of everything I had learned. It was to be a single, comprehensive campus for women in transition. It would include not only the secure, long-term housing of a shelter, but also on-site childcare, a legal aid clinic, therapy and wellness services, and a dedicated vocational center. This center would house a fully equipped wing of the Resilience Atelier, providing paid apprenticeships in fashion production. And at Chloe's suggestion, it would also include a therapeutic art studio, where residents could explore healing through clay, paint, and other media. She would run the studio herself. It was a holistic, audacious dream, a place not just to escape a crisis, but to completely rebuild a life from the ground up. We were in a planning meeting for the hub, spread out around the large table in my studio with our architect and the foundation's board when my housekeeper quietly entered. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low, "there is a man at the gate. He says he is your son." A hush fell over the room. I hadn't seen or spoken to Mark in over 2 years. After their lawyer's letter of surrender, he and Jessica had simply vanished from my life. I'd heard through a distant cousin that they had sold their house in Los Angeles and moved to Austin, drawn by its booming tech scene. That was all I knew. Did he say what he wants? I asked, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. No, ma'am, he just asked to see you. He is alone. I looked around the table at the concerned faces of my new family. Eleanor gave me a sharp, questioning look. Chloe's face was pale, a storm of conflicting emotions in her eyes. I took a deep breath. Please show him in. We'll take a short break, everyone. As the board members quietly filed out to the garden for coffee, I stood and waited. I felt strangely calm. The old anger, the deep, visceral hurt was gone. I was no longer the woman he had tried to break. I did not know who would be walking through that door, but I knew with absolute certainty who he would be meeting. The man who entered my studio was not the man I remembered. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled polo shirt and wrinkled chinos. The arrogant, commanding posture had been replaced by a weary slump. He was thinner, his face etched with lines of stress and exhaustion that hadn't been there before. The swaggering titan of finance had been replaced by a ghost. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the bolts of vibrant fabric, the sketches on the walls, the plans for the hub spread across the table. It was the nerve center of a world he had never understood, a world that had thrived so powerfully in his absence. "Hello, Mark," I said, my voice even neutral. "Mom," he said, and the word came out as a croak. He cleared his throat. I know I have no right to be here. I wouldn't be if." He trailed off, his gaze falling to the floor. I waited, giving him the silence he needed to find his words. This was his meeting, his purpose. I would not lead him. "It's all gone," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Everything. The company I was with in Austin, it was all crypto-backed assets. A new tech fund. It was supposed to be the next big thing, and it just evaporated. In a week, the stock is worthless. The investors are suing. Jessica, she left. She took Thomas and went back to her parents in Ohio. She said she couldn't handle another failure." The story came out in broken fragments, a confession of financial and personal ruin. He had lost his job, his investments, his wife, and his son, all in the space of a few short months. The entire identity he had built for himself, the foundation of money and success upon which he had judged me and the rest of the world, had crumbled into dust. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were hollowed out, filled not with anger but with a vast, desolate confusion. It was the look of a man who has followed his map to the end of the world only to find a sheer, bottomless cliff. "I did everything right," he said, his voice cracking with a bewildered sense of injustice. "I followed the rules. I made the smart plays. I hedged my bets. I built a fortress. And it was all wiped out. You gave away a fortune. You started a clothing company in your late 60s. You poured money into a charity. Everything you did was wrong according to the rules. It was emotional, reckless, irresponsible. And you succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. I don't understand. How?" That one word, how, was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. It wasn't a plea for money. It was a plea for understanding. He was finally asking a question, not making a demand. He was admitting that his map was useless, and he was asking how I had learned to navigate without one. I walked over to the table and picked up a small, smooth river stone I used as a paperweight. I turned it over in my palm. "You and I have always had a different understanding of value, Mark," I began, my voice soft but clear. "You spent your life learning the price of everything. You could calculate returns, analyze market trends, and quantify risk. But you never learned the value of anything. The price of a stock is a number on a screen that can vanish in an instant. The value of a safe home for a terrified child? That is absolute. The price of a designer dress is what someone is willing to pay. The value of the pride on the face of the woman who learned to sew it? That is immeasurable." I placed the stone back on the plans for the hub. "You thought I was giving money away," I continued. "I was converting it. I was converting volatile, meaningless numbers in a bank account into tangible, indestructible value in the real world. You built a fortress of money, Mark. Fortresses are designed to keep people out. They are cold, lonely places. I wasn't building a fortress. I was building a table. A long, sturdy table with room for everyone. You spent your life fighting for your slice of the pie, so terrified that someone else would get a bigger piece. I decided to stop fighting and just bake more pies." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were hearing a foreign language that he was only just beginning to comprehend. The concepts of compassion as an asset, of community as a return on investment, they were completely alien to him. "I have no money for you, Mark," I said, and he flinched, but I held up a hand. That's not why you came here anyway. You came here for an answer. And the answer is this: true wealth is not something you can lose in a market crash. It's the skills you have, the community you build, the positive impact you have on the lives of others. That is the only portfolio that is truly diversified against disaster. I walked over to the plans for the Resilience Hub. I pointed to the section detailing the financial and administrative offices. We are about to build this, a multi-million-dollar project. It will need a chief financial officer, someone meticulous, someone who understands budgets and legal structures, someone who can build a fiscal fortress, not to hoard wealth but to protect a mission. It is a difficult, demanding job. It pays a modest, nonprofit salary. It offers no stock options, only the chance to build something of real, lasting value. I turned and looked my son in the eye. His hollow gaze was now flickering with a tiny, terrified spark of something that might have been hope. "The job is yours if you want it," I said. "The work begins tomorrow." It was not forgiveness. It was not a welcome home party. It was a chance. A single, difficult, and demanding chance to set down his useless map and begin the hard work of learning to see the world. A chance to stop fighting for scraps and help bake some pies. A chance to rebuild his life, not on a foundation of numbers, but on a foundation of purpose. I had no idea if he would take it or if he would succeed if he did. But as Chloe re-entered the studio and stood beside me, her presence a quiet show of solidarity, I knew that I had, at last, done all I could. I had opened the door. The rest would be up to him. Mark didn't answer immediately. He stood frozen, caught in the chasm between the life that had been annihilated and the one that was being offered. The offer was a life raft, but it required him to let go of the wreckage of his pride. I could see the war in his eyes. The CFO of a multi-million-dollar charity was a respectable position, but it was a universe away from the high-stakes world of venture capital he had inhabited. It was a role of service, not of conquest. It meant answering to a board, to a mission, to me. It meant, in every conceivable way, starting over. Chloe, sensing the delicate, pivotal nature of the moment, stepped forward. She didn't speak to Mark, but to me. She said, her voice steady and clear, "Leo just sent over the final cost analysis for the ceramic kilns in the art studio. I think we can go with the larger model if we adjust the budget for the initial material purchase." Her words were seemingly mundane, a simple piece of business, but her intent was profound. She was demonstrating the new family dynamic. We were partners. We discussed, we collaborated, we built. She was showing Mark, not telling him, what this new world looked like. It was a world where his sister, the one he had always dismissed as flighty and emotional, was a competent and integral part of a major enterprise. The interjection seemed to break the spell for Mark. He looked from Chloe's calm, purposeful face to my expectant one. He took a shaky breath, and for the first time, he seemed to shed the last remnant of his old, arrogant skin. He looked simply like a man, lost and tired and defeated. "I don't know how," he whispered, the admission a raw and painful confession. "I know how to make money from money. I don't know how to do this, how to build this." "Neither did I at first," I said gently. "But you don't have to know everything at the start. You just have to be willing to learn. You have the skills, Mark. The question is, do you have the humility?" He was silent for a long time. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. "Okay," he said, the words small but solid. "Okay, I'll try." The work did indeed begin the next day. It was an awkward, tentative start. Mark arrived not in a suit, but in the same tired chinos, as if he were afraid of looking like he was assuming a role he hadn't earned. I didn't give him an office. I gave him a small desk in the corner of the bustling foundation headquarters, a space filled with the passionate chatter of social workers and program coordinators. I gave him a mountain of paperwork, grant proposals, construction bids, preliminary budgets, and an instruction: find the value. For the first few weeks, he was a ghost in the machine. He spoke only when spoken to. He ate lunch alone at his desk. He meticulously analyzed spreadsheets, his face a mask of concentration. I knew he was struggling. He was a man used to giving orders, now taking them. He was a shark in a world of dolphins, and he didn't know how to swim. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. One of the women from the shelter, a former bookkeeper named Sarah who is now part of our financial literacy program, was having trouble understanding a complex section of a grant application. She approached Mark's desk timidly. "Excuse me," she said, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I don't understand this section on fiscal projections. Could you?" I watched from my office, holding my breath. The old Mark would have dismissed her with a wave of his hand, annoyed by the interruption. But this Mark looked up, saw the genuine confusion and determination in her eyes, and hesitated. He looked at the paperwork, then back at her. "Pull up a chair," he said gruffly. For the next hour, I watched as my son, the former master of the universe, patiently explained the intricacies of nonprofit accounting to a survivor of domestic abuse. He didn't condescend. He didn't use jargon. He drew charts on a legal pad. He found analogies. He listened to her questions and re-explained until she understood. In that small, quiet moment of shared learning, something shifted. Mark wasn't just analyzing value anymore, he was creating it. He was using his vaunted skills not for personal gain, but to empower someone else. The fortress door had cracked open. From that day on, things began to change. Mark started talking to the other staff members, asking questions about their work, not just their budgets. He began to see the faces and the stories behind the numbers he was crunching. He saw how a small increase in the childcare budget could allow 3 more women to attend job training. He saw how a carefully negotiated contract with a food supplier could mean healthier meals for 24 children. The pie, he was discovering, was made of more than just flour and water. His relationship with Chloe remained the most complex. There was years of baggage between them, of rivalry and resentment. But here, in this new context, they were forced to be colleagues. Their first real conversation was a tense budget meeting for the art studio. Mark, in his old way, saw the kilns and clay as a cost center. Chloe, with her newfound confidence, defended it fiercely as an investment in mental health and healing. "The return on this investment, Mark," she argued, "is a woman rediscovering her own voice. How do you put a number on that?" "You can't," he admitted, "but we still have to pay for the electricity to run the kiln." It was a stalemate, the old world versus the new, but then something remarkable happened. They started to problem solve, together. They brainstormed the idea of a community showcase, selling the residents' artwork to help fund the studio. They drafted a proposal for a local arts grant. They were not fighting over the pie, they were finding a new recipe. I knew the true test would be Thomas. A few months into his new job, Mark told me he was flying to Ohio for the weekend. "Jessica is letting me see him," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of hope and terror. He didn't ask me for advice, and I didn't offer any. This was his journey to take. He came back on Monday looking exhausted but different. There was a lightness in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "We spent the whole weekend in the park," he told me later that day, leaning against the doorframe of my office. "We didn't go to a fancy restaurant. We didn't buy him expensive toys. We just threw a baseball for hours. He asked me about my new job. I told him I was helping his grandma build a big safe house for kids and their moms." Mark looked at me, his expression one of profound wonder. And you know what he said? He said, "So you're like a superhero now, Dad? I've closed $100 million deals, Mom. I've been on the cover of financial magazines. And nothing in my entire life has ever made me feel the way I did when he said that." That, I knew, was the true beginning of his redemption. It wasn't about the job or the money. It was about redefining success. It was about realizing that his son's admiration was worth more than any stock portfolio. Life settled into its new, extraordinary normal. The Resilience Hub broke ground, its frame rising against the desert sky, a monument to a new way of thinking. Chloe's art studio became a vibrant, healing space. Mark became an indispensable, if sometimes curmudgeonly, part of the foundation, respected for his sharp mind and his slowly growing heart. Jessica eventually moved back to California with Thomas, not to reunite with Mark, but to be closer to her son's father. They were learning to be co-parents, their relationship now based on the shared value of their child's well-being, rather than the volatile price of a stock. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting on my patio, the same patio where I had once felt so trapped and alone. Now it was filled with life. Chloe was sketching in a notebook, planning a new glaze. In the garden below, Mark was patiently teaching Thomas how to prune the roses, just as Arthur had once taught him. It was not the family I had started with, not the perfect, polished image I had once tried to maintain. It was something far more real. It was a mosaic, pieced together from broken fragments, stronger and more beautiful for the cracks. It was a family reborn. My story had started with an ending, the death of my husband and the betrayal of my children. But it had become a story of 1,000 new beginnings. It was proof that a life is not a single, linear narrative, but a collection of seasons. And the most vibrant, fruitful, and resilient season can begin at any time, often when you least expect it, armed with nothing more than the courage to turn on the lights and the wisdom to know that the greatest treasures are not the ones you hoard, but the ones you give away.